Well, the House will come to order, and they're not sitting for the next 6 weeks, but...
It's not a bad line of Julia Gillard's, is it? Like, I have absolutely no criticism to make of that wild pack of mouth-breathing sexist freaks, all right? Nothing at all to say
Presumably
against
she
them.
wasn't crazy about the person who drew the placard and left the possessor of...
No criticism of that person. It was Tony Abbott who stood in front of it. Now, should he have allowed himself to be in that situation, Gerard, when he stood in front of those placards?
Well, if you have normal good staff work, you'd have an advance group out there to find out what the signs were. If the signs weren't suitable, you get them taken away. If they wouldn't do that, you have the meeting indoors. I think there was bad staff work, bad advance work. On the other hand, I mean, if he gets up and makes a speech and someone comes around behind him, I don't think you can really blame him. Well, it could have been better handled, but John Howard was called a murderer, which I think is worse than being called, which, I think all these references to our Prime Minister, whether it's Ms Gillard or Mr Howard, are contemptible, and I don't like them, but not just Julia Gillard.
In the end, it's a question of whether the photo exists, right? And it's the image that's there for everybody to see.
The stronger problem is the tag that he's mixing with extremists and on the same sort of same speak as there. And the League of Rights is a vile anti-Semitic group.
It virtually doesn't exist anymore. I've been fighting the League of Rights for 40 years, and I can tell you it virtually doesn't exist. Pauline Hanson. All the media beat up about Pauline Hanson. Once you get less than 2% of the vote,
which goes
another
to show,
failure.
That you know, well, I think, as I said before, the lesson from the New South Wales election is a distaste for extremes, right? And, you know, on that basis, I do think that those images are problematic for Tony Abbott. I don't think they're deadly. I just think that they're just, you know... Both sides of politics here on the carbon tax debate are trying to appeal to a solid middle ground, right? And, you know, just as breaking a promise on a carbon tax does not do you any favours on that front, neither does, you know, mixing with rowdy rallies with placards like that. I think it's not a great idea.
And you raised the Pauline Hanson thing, and that's true. She couldn't get elected into the upper house in New South Wales, but because he shared an event with her, it enabled Julia Gillard and others to make this point. Have a look at this.
We've got to stop our politicians just pushing this on to us. They're destroying our lifestyle, our way of life, our culture, our country.
On the question of attending the rally outside Parliament House today, I'm not aware that I was invited, Mr Speaker, but as I understand it, the Leader of the Opposition did not lack for red-headed company out at that rally, Mr Speaker. He had a red-headed friend out at that rally, so I'm sure he would not have missed me.
So it's a guilt by association sort of argument,
but
I suppose.
you can't have Pauline Hanson taken out. You know, you can't. You can stop a sign, but you can't stop a person being at a function. It's
if she's there, you have a decision to make. You can not turn up.
Well, you can do some advance work. I don't know whether they knew she was coming or not, but it's a bit hard not to turn up to something just because she's there. I mean, I think the argument about the placards is a reasonable argument. I think the presence of Pauline Hanson makes it very difficult. It would mean that Tony Abbott could never go anywhere that Pauline Hanson was, presumably including the AFL Grand Final. I mean, this is...
Well, he usually goes to places that Pauline Hanson isn't at. I mean,
well, look,
this was
the truth is that no one persecuted and prosecuted Pauline Hanson stronger than Tony Abbott did.
Yep, that's true.
In the early years of the Howard government, Abbott went after Hanson, and Hanson bitterly resents it. So I think, you know, I don't think there's much of a link there.
Graham Richardson on Sky had this advice for Tony Abbott.
And I think what you do in those circumstances is you send out your Barnaby Joyces, because that's their go. They speak to audiences like that all the time. He carries on like a two-bob watch. So you send out the B grade, but you don't have the A grade sully themselves. And Abbott, I think, is digging a very big hole for himself. The only reason that Gillard went back up in the polls and Labor went back up in the polls this week has got nothing to do with Gillard's performance and everything to do with Abbott's.
So what do you make of that final observation with the opinion poll?
I disagree. You know, my long-standing view, and I don't think it's really affected with by anything that Tony Abbott's done or whatever in the last week or two. I think that this government, this federal government, if it falls over, it'll be entirely because of things that it's done, not because of anything that Tony Abbott's done.
I think we need more than one poll to see what's happening, and I'm wary of the interpretation that it's because she took a firm stand and finally said we'll have a carbon tax that she went up. I mean, she's selling that tax in the most extraordinary way. According to Treasury, in its plausible calculations, food and grocery prices will go up by 1/10 of 1%. And she said on several occasions now, when you walk into a supermarket, you will see large changes in prices. And a bizarre statement that those that have carbon pollution embedded in them, they'll go up a lot, and those that don't have carbon pollution embedded in them will go down a lot. they'll all be the same. She doesn't understand how the scheme's working. I mean, no labels on the tins and no difference in price.
Right, but to that point, though, that, who was responsible for the poll fluctuating as it did, surely it was because it focused, the story focused for a long time on the lie, and then it changed to compensation, and in the middle of all of that, Tony Abbott went one way on the science and then another.
Well, it's one poll, and I don't know what's going to happen. If you level them out at the moment, I think it's fair to say that Labor's behind, but Julia Gillard probably came back a bit last week, but I think it's far too early to judge that.
I'm boycotting polls this year because I think they're massively corrosive to the political process, and I think journalists who criticise politicians for being cowardly are just as addicted to opinion polls as they are. But I do think that it's not really rocket science that the initial response to Julia Gillard announcing a blanket, we're going to have a carbon tax, can't tell you what it's going to look like at the moment or how much it's going to be. I mean, people are going to respond to that in a pretty negative way. I think it's not particularly a work of genius to work that out. The question is whether she can, having calculatedly taken that hit, build it up over the next couple of years by explaining how this thing's going to work and getting it through the Parliament, whether she can recover her position in time for the actual poll when it happens.